Over the next couple of weeks, we will focus on some of the more basic components of teaching writing and communication, which are handwriting, spelling, and language. So this week, we'll focus on handwriting. Next week will be spelling, and the following will be language. And just as you're viewing the video, there are going to be quite a few resources linked. So please make sure that you engage with those. It will really help you in understanding how to connect this material with your actual teaching. I think the first thing that's really important to talk about is what you should expect from different grade levels. Sometimes teachers will expect a first grader to be able to do things at a fourth grade level, or students who have certain exceptionalities will be expected to do things that they aren't quite ready to do. So you really start working on handwriting in kindergarten and first grade. In first grade, it's a lot of readiness. So tracing, coloring, and copying. And as you'll see, I have links there to help you understand what those things look like, how they're different, how tracing might be different than copying, that kind of thing. In second grade and end of first grade, students generally start working on fluency and automaticity. Again, I've linked some resources to help you understand what that looks like. And then in third grade, that's really where letter formation, numbers, and words comes in. You will see some of this repeated, obviously, because that's how we get better at handwriting. But that's generally when these things are taking place. And then after third grade, the focus shifts to self-expression, grammar, and quality of content. So this may look a little different than what the standards expect, but in terms of handwriting, this is really what we're focusing on. So it's not letter recognition and that kind of thing, but actual writing skills. So take a minute, pause, and investigate at least 3 of these resources, though I think it would be helpful to you to look at all of them to make sure you understand what these concepts are. So using those resources that you just reviewed, you're going to complete a 3-2-1. And you have a spot to respond to this. So you're going to tell us 3 new things you learned about handwriting by investigating the linked resources. And if you can't think of 3 new things, at least 3 things that you think that you'll need to focus on in your classroom. And even if you're in the middle and the high school, you will still be working on handwriting in some ways. What are 2 handwriting activities you want to try in your classroom? And then what is 1 question you have about teaching handwriting? So go ahead, take some time and complete your 3-2-1. So what causes handwriting difficulty? Well, a lot of teachers have trouble with legibility. It's hard to read what your students wrote. Students may not be fluent writers. They have to start and stop quite a bit. And they may not write accurately or quickly. If you're in the early grades or working with students who have exceptionalities related to spatial awareness, you may have quite a few students who invert letters, which can be really confusing. They'll put a D when they meant a P, that kind of thing. One thing to know about letters is that with letters and numbers are the first time a child encounters something that isn't the same thing when you flip it over. So like if you have your phone in your hand and you turn it upside down, it remains your phone. If you turn a D upside down, it could become a B, it could become a P. And that's the first time students ever really encounter that concept. So it can be difficult. And then there are a lot of different things that can make these students have difficulty with these things. Motor development is a large one. Visual perception, developing visual memory, lack of quality instruction, and that's kind of a big one now because of the digital divide. A lot of students aren't getting as much handwriting instruction as they used to. So that's actually causing more issues with handwriting now. And then more teacher-centered instruction than student-centered instruction. If you have a chance to investigate Orton Gillingham, that program of learning letter sense, actually they have a handwriting component as well, and a lot of it is really student centered, where the student enjoyment is at the center of learning. So we need to move away from the teacher-centered instruction of worksheets and just constant practice. Though practice is important, but we need to remember that student engagement is equally as important. So I already mentioned this, that letters and numbers don't stay the same, and that's difficult. And then students show a variety of areas for growth that, you know, it depends on the student what they may need. So some students write very slowly. Some put numbers and letters going in the wrong direction. Some have too much or too little slant. A big one I noticed a lot in the middle grades was spacing. I don't think we pay enough attention to that when we teach writing, and so students will cram a lot of words together, which makes it hard to read, or they'll space them too much, which also can interrupt our eyes' ability to track fluently. Also pencil pressure, neatness, legibility, and then mirror writing, which again, I linked a resource so you can take a look at what that is and learn a little bit more about it. So take a second to reflect. Did you have difficulty with handwriting in school? And which of the 8 areas was challenging for you? I know for me, I still struggle with handwriting, but for me, a lot of it is legibility and spacing. I have a difficult time making sure my words are spaced appropriately. Okay, assessing handwriting. Again, I've linked some resources that I would like you to investigate, particularly if you're not familiar with the term norm reference tests, though I believe you've probably talked about that in some of your other courses, but we don't use a lot of those for handwriting. More of it is informal and observation assessment, and then obtaining a 3-minute sample can be really good because that timing is crucial for checking the writing fluency. So since informal handwriting handwriting assessment is the most common, I wanted to put some questions up here for you to think about as you're informally assessing your students' handwriting. So are they gripping the pencil correctly? Are they putting the paper in the right spot on their desk? Are they sitting up appropriately, or are their heads too close to the paper, which can also help us understand when students have vision difficulties? Are they always writing with the same hand? If students are switching hands, that could indicate that they can use both for writing, but it also may indicate they've never been really taught the appropriate way to write, so they may not know what their dominant hand is. If the student's getting frustrated or nervous, or if they have a negative attitude. So those are some things to look for when we're assessing handwriting informally. When analyzing for error patterns, there are a few things that you want to look specifically for. Letter formation, which means exposing one letter at a time to different formation of lines and strokes. Letter size, alignment, so the evenness of the letters along the line on your paper, and seeing how if the height among the letters varies. Spacing, as we mentioned before. The line quality, so if it's thick and steady, or if the student's real shaky when they're writing. The slant, which is something that will be taught more in the elementary grades, but isn't always, and then the rate that they're writing at. So I'm going to have you pause again and watch the video to help you understand the various handwriting factors you should be analyzing. Once you've watched the video, try an informal handwriting assessment on a volunteer. So if you have a student or even a family member, parent, whomever, it's fine. But I want you to try out an informal handwriting assessment so that you can kind of get a feel for how this works. And I've linked a sample writing assessment page for you to use. And remember that you're still learning. So don't really offer any feedback on handwriting right now if you're talking with a child, because you don't actually know all of it yet. The goal of this is really just to give you some practice. So take a second, watch the linked video, and then download the assessment page, and if you can, try it out. Okay, hopefully you tried the handwriting assessment. If not, next time you are working with your student, if handwriting is something you're working on, or if writing in general is something you're working on and you hadn't thought to work on handwriting, give it a try. One thing to remember is that different age groups will have a suggested total number of letters written, but remember that when you're working with students with exceptionalities, sometimes even if they're in 12th grade, their expected grade level might be a 3rd grade or 2nd grade level. So keep that in mind when you're doing these informal or formal observations. So I want you to take a second and stop and think about why girls might be expected to write at a faster rate than boys. So there are a lot of words on this slide that explain why a girl tends to develop handwriting skills prior to a boy. And if you hypothesized that it was social development or environmental, that's actually not the case. According to the Vlachos and Bonatti article that I've cited here, really it has to do with which hemisphere of the brain develops first. So for girls, their left hemisphere tends to develop first, and boys it's the right hemisphere, and that left hemisphere tends to regulate fine motor skills, language processing, and that kind of thing. And for boys, that tends to develop after 6 years old. But the good news is that boys catch up by age 11, generally. And then if a student isn't very proficient in handwriting early on, they tend to improve with age. So it kind of all evens out by middle school. If there are interventions. If not, students who had difficulty with handwriting early on will continue to have difficulty. The one caveat to that is that students with learning disabilities such as dysgraphia, between 70 and 90% of those students have difficulty with handwriting. So it's important to remember when you're working with students with exceptionalities that these numbers that we aspire to in terms of how fast students should write, they're not always going to apply. So keep that in mind, but I think it's very interesting that what we see in practice, which is girls tend to have better handwriting than boys, is actually not a socialized reason, but a biological brain neural development reason. Okay, the next thing we're going to discuss is assessment samples. So if you take a look at this slide, you see kind of an elementary handwriting rubric, but it's actually a very simple way to have a student look at their own handwriting and assess themselves. So did I form my letters correctly? Did I write in the correct lines and spaces? That kind of thing. You could obviously modify this to be used in the older grades, but it's a really simple self-check for students. And then here's a more formal record sheet that you as the teacher could use, looking to see if all of these things are done correctly, and if not, how the student could work on that. Second page of it. And then just a very similar assessment that you can use as a teacher. Again, just another example. Okay, so the next thing we're going to discuss, now that you have a background understanding of what handwriting is, what students may struggle with, we're going to talk about how you can teach it. The most important things to remember is it should be brief but frequent lessons. Long, occasional lessons will not be helpful because students need a lot of practice. Something you might not have thought too much about prior to this presentation is when a student's ready to begin writing, actually physically writing. That those students must have muscular control, hand-eye coordination, and also visual discrimination before they can start writing. So a way to know if they're ready is that they can perform hand movements up and down, left and right, and forward and back. They can trace, they can connect dots, they can draw lines vertically and horizontally. They can do a backward circle, a curved line, a forward circle, all things that are components of letters. They can draw slanted lines. They can copy simple designs, and they can name letters and discern the likenesses among them, which is, absolutely required before they can start writing letters. Stop and think about other ways that you could assess motor function before beginning writing instruction. And so what we've talked about on this last slide is really things you might have students do on paper. But for example, you might have students, rather than tracing letters, you might have written the letters on the page and then have them break sticks if it's like fall, so that they can make their name out of sticks. And you can tell how, based on how they place those on the paper, if they understand what the letters are, if they can discriminate among the sizes of the letters and how much of the stick they need to put on the paper. So what other ways might you be able to be creative and assess motor function? When students start to learn to write, the first thing that's important is to determine hand preference. And that's not as easy as it sounds sometimes. So I've linked an article that can help you figure out what a student's hand preference is. Make sure they have a comfortable place to sit and that they're seated with good posture and at the right height, because when students first start writing, it can feel really awkward. So it's important that they are seated in a comfortable spot, that they're using their non-writing hand to hold the paper, and also that they're placed so that they're not bumping their partner, the student sitting next to them. And then also help them learn how to hold the pencil firmly, but not too firmly. And sometimes students may need a little pencil guide for that. During instruction, the pencil should be held about an inch above its point by right-handers, and the pencil end should point toward the right shoulder. For left-handers, it's about 1.25 inches from the writing point, and the pencil should point toward the left elbow. There are those pencil grips that you can get to help at the beginning, and students should be encouraged to use a reasonably comfortable grip to avoid fatigue or discomfort when writing for an extended period, particularly at the beginning. Okay, so we have two types of writing that we teach, manuscript and cursive. So if you didn't know, the word for just print writing is manuscript. This is usually taught in kindergarten and first grade. It's based entirely on basic shapes of circles and straight lines. Handwriting instruction in kindergarten often focuses on teaching children to recognize and form capital and lowercase letters and to write their names and other common words. You'll see a lot of focus on writing names just because that's become so familiar to students so quickly. And then students in first grade focus on forming uppercase and lowercase letters, spacing between letters, and developing skills related to legibility. Students who have difficulty with handwriting should have a little bit of supplemental instruction. So there's a 4-step sequence that you can follow for writing lowercase letters accurately. First is the warm-up, where students practice naming, matching, and sequencing those letters. Then they practice writing the unit letters in isolation. And then they write a sentence containing those unit letters during a 3-minute time frame. So this kind of helps with that writing fluency I mentioned earlier. And the students record the number of letters written, and then the teacher models how to make a unit letter in a funny way. So you might see them make a U into a snake, or I'm sorry, an S into a snake, or something like that to help students have a little bit more fun with it. Students with learning disabilities write about half the rate of students without them. They typically produce writing that is less legible, and then illegibility and numerous incorrect spellings can cause teachers to negatively judge their writing samples. So if it's illegible, teachers often don't give the student as much credit. So that's something to keep in mind just as you're beginning to work with these students more frequently, that you remember that illegible writing doesn't mean bad writing. There is a bit of controversy surrounding handwriting instruction, particularly because of the digital world that we live in now. Some researchers advocate for explicit teaching of transcription skills, others advocate for not doing that. A lot of the research shows that teaching handwriting in context is really helpful to students, but it's important to remember that with students with learning disabilities, their writing performance increases when they've been given handwriting and spelling instruction. I think a lot of the reason being that we judge more harshly students who have difficulties with those things. So some explicit instruction is required for some students. So I want you to reflect again on how much handwriting instruction, or how might handwriting instruction differ for general education and special education students, now that you've learned a little bit about what it entails. So when teaching handwriting, it's important to sequence instruction to group letters that are formed similarly. So when we teach reading, we often separate letters like D and B, because that can be confusing when students are learning their letters. When we teach handwriting, it's actually more useful to teach letters like D and B together because they use the same motor functions. So it's a little bit the opposite of how you teach reading or phonics awareness. You're going to model how to form each letter, so you'll show them and provide multiple practice opportunities in a lot of different spaces. So you can have students write the letters, you can have them write them in the air with their hands, you can have them draw them in the sand or using shaving cream. So a lot of different ways to practice writing the letters. Provide physical assistance and visual cues, so you're going to have to physically help students place their pencil and also visually show them how to do it, how to properly hold the pencil and the grip, and then teach about proper placement of the paper. A lot of times teachers ignore that, but it's really important that the paper is placed appropriately on the desk, so then the student can learn about slant and spacing and that kind of thing. So as we've mentioned, lots of opportunities to practice frequently, but very short amounts of time. And also remember that students are not just learning what the letters look like, they're also learning how they work in context. So the writing process should not be lost in the practice of writing individual letters. Okay, so then students in second or third grade often will transition to writing cursive, and you can introduce it earlier. There's some controversy around this as well, but a lot of studies show that cursive writing instruction will help students cognitively in a lot of other areas. So start with the easy letters that kind of mimic the manuscript letters, and then transition to the more difficult letters that don't work the same way as their manuscript counterparts, like the Z, for example. And I just am including this so you can see kind of how we teach cursive. A lot of it has to do with arrows, showing students where their pen should go and that they should not, or pencil, and that they should not pick it up off the paper. The strokes are connected. This slide shows letter families. So these are letters that you'll teach kind of at the same time when you teach cursive, because they're formed similarly. And also, like the second one, these are the ones that have a handle. So when you draw the letter, it has to have a handle to connect it to the letter before it, the letter after it. And then hump-shaped letters, things that work like C, the letter C, tails at the back, tails at the front. So those are just suggested to teach together since they work similarly. A lot of research shows that the most common errors should be taught together. Tompkins suggested R, K, P, and Z, and Newland suggested A, E, R, and T. R is generally the most difficult for students because it doesn't really look like a letter, and so they have a tough time transitioning from the manuscript writing to the R in cursive. Some activities to do to get students ready to start writing. Use the body exercises so that they're using their hands to mimic what they would do with the pencil. Have students use scissors to cut out shapes, which helps improve motor skills. Coloring activities can be a really good way to get students motivated to work on handwriting, but also develop muscle control and coordination, hand-eye coordination. During seat work, students can practice making circles by drawing things that they love, like funny faces or balloons, that kind of thing. You also can have them do, like I had mentioned, snapping sticks before. Anything that will strengthen their hand and finger muscles. Things that they might enjoy would be finger painting or clay, Play-Doh, that kind of thing. Have them connect dots. Have them use the chalkboard. I don't know, for me, my students loved going up to the whiteboard and showing what they'd been doing at their desks. That was a real excitement for them. And I guess a really important thing to remember is that we can always connect handwriting to the other academic things they're doing. And if a student is really struggling with handwriting, don't let that keep them from learning whatever other academic content they need to learn or demonstrating their learning. So if a student isn't at the point yet where their handwriting is legible, let them answer the questions orally. Don't let handwriting impede their learning or their ability to be assessed. You can have students practice writing movements in a tray filled with like sand, salt, cornmeal. I always loved using shaving cream. That was always fun but messy. Provide them the opportunity to trace, make stencils so that if they're having trouble, that they can use the stencil to help guide them. And give them pictures containing hidden uppercase and lowercase manuscript letters that can help them with the visual discrimination so that they can pull out letters from an image. Okay, so I want you to think about the readiness activities we've just discussed and find a video or resource related to your favorite activity that you can share. So something that will give us an idea of how you could incorporate this in the classroom or why you might not incorporate this in the classroom. If you don't want to find your favorite, you could find one that you think isn't very good, but just a resource or a video related to that thing. Okay, manuscript writing activities. You can give a student an individual copy of the alphabet and numbers 0 through 9 to use at their desk. You can have a student form the manuscript letters and numbers by drawing between double lines of outlined letters. That's probably one of the more common things you see, like worksheet activities. You can use paper with squares to help students maintain correct letter size, proportion, and spacing, and have students form manuscript letters and numbers by completing slash to slash and dot to dot activities. Again, we see that quite a bit. Some kind of more creative ones on a piece of oak tag, you could print uppercase letters and lowercase letters and then have students cut the pair to form a puzzle piece so that they're making something creative in addition to learning their letters or how to write the letters. Use arrows to provide direction clues, like I mentioned with the cursive. You can do that with the manuscript letters as well, especially ones that have multiple points. So like an H, sometimes students will write that backwards. They'll start on the right and go to the left. So giving them arrow clues will really help with that. Use color dots to indicate starting and stopping positions for each letter stroke. Again, particularly when they're doing them backwards or upside down. And have the students who reverse letters like B and D form an association to facilitate memory of the letters. So like I've seen teachers draw a bed and put a B at the beginning for the headboard and pillow and a D at the end for the footboard, so that students can remember using the word bed that B starts and thus has to go to the right and D ends and has to go to the left. So you can also put an alphabet tape to the desk, but really having those mnemonic devices can help students remember which direction a letter should be facing. You can have them announce strokes while writing certain letters. That can be fun as a choral activity. On wood, you could print letters and then kind of make it into a stencil so students can follow it and use it to help them. You can make cardboard frames so students have to stay in the lines, kind of like they do with coloring. This could help them learn to stay in a smaller size or bigger, depending on how small or big they're writing. And then with spacing, you can give them like graph paper or something to put underneath so that they can understand how long or how much space a single word should take. An additional method for students who have difficulty remembering to space words is using a two-leaded pencil that has red on one end and blue on the other. That way, students can indicate with the color what word comes next until they're able to have that spacing. And then you can always have them put their index finger in between words. And the older students get, it seems to me, the less likely they are to want to do that one. I had a 7th grader who absolutely refused, and so it was really hard to read his writing. So I actually, for a little while, had him doing the different colored ink, and it just got so tedious. He eventually just did better with spacing. But whatever strategy you can do to help you understand what the student is trying to communicate and also give them a chance to work on the skill. For cursive writing, a lot of these are going to be similar, just using it with cursive instead of print. And you want to remember that some of these activities will build off of what they already know from manuscript letters. So you could put the manuscript A next to the cursive A so that they can see the similarities and differences. More dot to dot, more more tracing. And yeah, you can start out by giving a lot of cues to students about when they're supposed to move on to the next stroke, and then just gradually take those cues away, so we'll scaffold it for them. More of the same stuff, just with cursive rather than manuscript. And when I mentioned word families before, it's finding those words that have similar patterns and teaching those together. So finally, I just wanted to share with you some commercial writing programs that you may be faced with when you're working. It depends on what school you're at, what they use. I liked Handwriting Without Tears. You can find a lot of their stuff for free online, and I think it's pretty good. You might pull a little bit out of each one depending on what you have to do and who you're working with. My difficulty with the programs is they tend to be very elementary, because obviously most students who are learning handwriting are in elementary school, but when you're working with students with exceptionalities, you may have to work on handwriting, and then you're going to need to find something that's a little bit less elementary focused. So that can be difficult, but these are the ones you may see. I hope this is helpful to you when you get into the classroom, and yeah, please let me know if you have any questions.